Okay, so thank you to everyone who has joined us today. My name is Megan Crane. I'm with True Transition, and I will be introducing the panelists today. Again, I want to thank you for your interest in the report addressing methane emissions in Louisiana. How many workers will it take? I would like to go ahead and at the very beginning, at the very start, encourage you to remain in contact with us by joining the True Transition mailing list. That's the best way to receive updates. And that includes to receive the full report once it is ready for distribution. Again, thank you very much for your interest and for joining us today. We have some fantastic panelists, and the first person to present will be Dr. Greg Cumpton, the director of the Ray Marshall Center, University of Texas, Austin. And so without any further delay, I will give it over to you, Dr. Greg Cumpton.
Thank you so much, Megan. I'm gonna share my screen here and provide. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. Hello, everybody. I am Dr. Greg Cumpton. I am as Megan mentioned, the director of the Ray Marshall Center. We are an organized research unit out of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin. The work that I do typically with the Ray Marshall Center deals with workforce development policy. So the type of training that workers need to engage in work and whether the work that they find after that training is aligned with their training and whether they find appropriate employment outcomes because of that training. Another strain of work that I engage in is similar to the work that I'm doing here for Louisiana, and that is as regulations or rules are implemented at the federal, state, or local level, what impact does that have on jobs? And in many cases, it requires additional work. You know, if you are having, you need meat inspectors in order to inspect the meat, you're actually going to have to hire individuals in order to do that work. And if the federal government is not doing that hiring, then private organizations need to do so. So this is the third in a string of reports around various regions. So I engaged in this work in Texas, as well as the Appalachia region, and then now in Louisiana, which has some very interesting and unique contexts around to estimate this. You see my email below. I engage in this work across the country. So if you're interested in looking at another state, please feel free to contact me directly. So I really appreciate this opportunity. I really look directly here at the number of workers that would be needed in Louisiana to meet new EPA rules. So my plan here is to discuss sort of what are some of those rules that are out there, what needs to be inspected, some of the methodology that I talk about very at a high level, and then I include the actual numbers and some conclusions. So it's not a ton of slides here, but a lot more details contained within the report in the section that I wrote. So I encourage you to read that once that's completed. So without further ado, so the EPA rules actually and regulations impact a whole host of oil and gas infrastructure from from extraction all the way into processing. These include things like leak detection and repair, the pneumatic controllers that are frequently used, compressor stations, also compressors. Two types of compressors are typically used, and these are both fall under new EPA rules. The reciprocating, which is dry seal, and the centrifugal, which are wet seal. Centrifugal are notorious emitters of methane, and so a lot of those will require replacement and abatement. And then also storage tanks, right? Here's where specifically talking the EPA rules focus on storage tanks. There are other sets of tanks that aren't classified as storage necessarily, that don't really fall under the EPA rules, but that could also provide some leaks in methane that eventually may be included depending on the expansion of those rules over time. So in order to meet compliance, there are a number of processes that need to happen, both the monitoring and maintenance, as well as replacement and abatement. For monitoring and maintenance, though the rules do include some aspect of using additional technologies to measure, and monitor wells and their and their leaks. Primarily, the focus is on audible, visual, olfactory monitoring of wells, and monthly monitor. That's a quarterly for wells, and then monthly monitoring of compressor stations for leaks. Repairs need to be followed based on need, and then engage also in compressor maintenance for monitoring maintenance as well as storage tank maintenance. So the monitoring maintenance, those positions are going to be ongoing, right? Once you hire somebody to do that work is going to need to be completed on a regular basis. If you have additional wells or additional compressor stations, you may need to hire additional workers in order to engage in that work. And then some of the work in order to meet these new rules is primarily focused on replacement and abatement. So this includes replacing pneumatic controllers, which are also notorious leakers of methane and other gases, as well as compressor replacements and abatements, as well as storage tank replacement and abatement. The jobs that are related to replacing and abating the methane emissions for the EPA rules, these will be temporary. But some of that work could take several years. It just depends on the pace of work and the other duties that individuals that engage in that work are responsible for completing. So one of the fascinating things about Louisiana would be the really unique context in which it exists. There are active oil and gas infrastructure exist in 3 very different ecological settings in Louisiana. Those ecological settings deeply impact the cost and hours of work, and we know this from already previously completed research. So onshore well sites and other compressor stations, et cetera, represent wholly land-based operations. Those comprise 91% of infrastructure in Louisiana. Inland waterways represent a vast network of facilities in the Mississippi Delta that are near or at the water's surface. Those represent about 6% of all infrastructure. And then offshore includes facilities within Louisiana's Gulf Coast waterways, and that's about 3%. Part of the reason for noting these different contexts is naturally the type of work that you're going to engage in is going to differ based on where those sites are, and that actually will impact things like the cost and the number of individuals that need to be engaged in that work. So we know a lot of detail about the cost of onshore work. All right, there's a fair amount of research into what it takes to engage in these monitoring, evaluation, and also replacement and abatement. But for these other sites, for inland waterways and for offshore, there's not as much research, but there is some, and so we rely on that to really provide an estimate of, well, what might be the additional cost in relation to onshore sites. So inland waterway costs and labor are estimated roughly 302% greater than onshore, and offshore costs and labor are roughly 320% greater than onshore. Right, and you can see we reference Adgerton as well in this, and that's more detail of that can be found in the report. Right. And so knowing this, knowing the distribution of the sites and also where those sites are located, this provides us 3 different contexts with which to evaluate the number of jobs that will be needed and available for workers to engage in this work to appropriately reduce methane emissions. In order to calculate the workers that are needed in those different contexts, we use 2 specific methodologies. And the first one is particularly in the case of methane leak inspection, detection, and repair, we focus just on the number of hours that we know need to be completed in order to finish those tasks. And then we use those number of hours to therefore derive the number of workers that are needed to perform that work. The reason we do that is there is a copious amount of information on how long it takes to engage in methane leak inspection and detection and repair. And so we're able to just use the hours of work that we would estimate from that in order to calculate the number of workers. And then for other methane emissions strategies that are engaged in here, so such as replacing pneumatic controllers, replacing compressors, adding flare systems to storage tanks, decommissioning orphaned well sites. Here, we don't have as much information necessarily on the exact hours that are needed to complete that work, because primarily this is, they contract and they look at the costs associated with them. So in order to estimate the number of hours for work and therefore the number of workers, we use cited cost of installation and maintenance, and we divide by the assumed hourly cost of work, which then allows us to calculate the number of hours and the number of worker hours, and therefore estimate the number number of total workers for that, right? So we're trying to use the most available information that we have in order to best calculate the number of workers that we need to complete that work. And one note here that I will make several times is the focus of the entire work that we put together, including my section, is really looking only at direct workers. And I do that for a number of reasons. First of all, this is where I have the most detailed information, right? And I want to use that detailed information to build out, to identify the total number of direct workers that would be there. But also, I think that the moment I engage in work that's talking about like multipliers and other types like this, where that work will be, there tends to be a bit more controversy as to how might you tweak that if you were to make some various different assumptions here. And by focusing on the direct workers, are really just am able to sidestep that question. These are the workers we know that need to be completed the work. I will say that this definitely means that there are going to be additional indirect workers that would result from those work. So the calculation that I provide for the number of workers that are needed here is definitely an undercount, without a doubt. And moreover, here I'm really focusing on just those minimum needs in order to meet EPA regulations and rules. So, for example, a moment ago, I talked about that there are various processing tanks and that outside of the storage tanks that should need to be evaluated and monitored. So here we're only looking at those to meet EPA rules. If we were to really try to fully address all of the methane emissions that are out there in order to reduce them effectively to meet climate goals, et cetera, it would require still more work and hence more jobs. So once again, emphasize, I'm providing sort of that baseline of exactly what we would need in order to just meet those EPA rules. There are a lot of details in the report. This is where I get to wave my hand like a magician that go through exactly how I've gone through this process. And I get to skip that for y'all in this case and refer you to the report. And I'm going to move right ahead to look at the number of jobs that we've calculated in order to meet these EPA rules. So estimate that Louisiana will need a minimum of 2,609 jobs in order to engage in this work to meet EPA regulations. There for monitoring and maintenance, about 1,053 ongoing jobs. Those will continue and need to be filled continuously. And then for replacement and abatement, about 1,500 temporary jobs. Those may need to be completed. That work may need to be completed over several years. But once that work is completed and those pieces have been replaced, then essentially that would enable us to those jobs should no longer be needed. However, note that the skills that individuals learn in those temporary positions would be transferable to engaging in new construction and at new sites as well. So those people, though those positions may end, the skill sets they have are transferable to future work in the oil and gas industry. For example, in engaging in work, when we talk about orphan wells and capping orphan wells, some of the skills they learn here could be potentially transferable to that as well. So very important. And you can see the distribution from both of these, that a lot of these, in terms of the monitoring and maintenance, a fair portion of those jobs are related to leak repair. Once you find leaks, it takes a fair amount of time and effort, as you can imagine, to repair those leaks. And then also the next highest distribution there on that leak inspection and detection, right? Making sure that their sites are being appropriately monitored and that monitoring takes place in consistent and accurate manner, right? And then when we talk about replacement and abatement, really the largest portion of those jobs is definitely going to be in that pneumatic controller replacement. Pneumatic controllers are often at every individual well, every well site. There are many of these, and so they're all going to need to be replaced. That takes a fair number of jobs in order to complete that work over this time. So, and then just some general conclusions around this work. First of all, these jobs, they require a really high level of skill and knowledge. So these are important jobs that you need to train individuals to engage in. We also know that there are a number of workers in Louisiana with prior experience in the oil and gas industry. These are workers that have some skills that could be built up to engage in this work. And if they don't directly have those skills, they're certainly capable of learning those skills and knowledge. So there's definitely a potential workforce for individuals that may be seeking work that they could easily transition into this effort. A majority of jobs required to meet EPA regulations will involve replacing equipment or installing abatement measures. And so that's focusing on that. And then note, as I mentioned earlier, the skill sets that we involve in replacing and abatement tasks, it's going to be transferable to that future installation and management of new equipment. And so though those jobs may be temporary, those workers may still find really additional important work with the skill sets that they gain from this. And once again, job numbers here reflect only direct workers engaged in the work. So undercount the total number of jobs needed to meet those EPA regulations. This is, I really appreciate the time and effort y'all have had for me to go through my presentation today. And I'm here to answer any additional questions that might come up. And I'm going to turn it back over to our host. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Greg Cumpton. That was very informative. I am very happy to introduce our second panelist today. This is Megan Biven with True Transition. And I also wanted to mention we've had a couple of excellent questions. If you have a question that you'd like answered, we're going to save all questions for the end and just pop that into the Q&A, as I think the chat is actually disabled, but the Q&A can take those questions and we'll ask those at the end. And so, Megan, I will let you give your presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up today. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day and your morning. Okay, it's going to be a slightly faster pace. I'm a fairly fast talker and a bit more slides. So thank you, Greg, for giving me some extra time to present on this. Let's see how I share entire screen. There we go. Sorry, you're gonna have to see my whole screen for a second. Share. And apologies as we get this to the whole size. Okay, great. And so my section will be focusing on, surprise, orphaned wells and all unplugged wells in Louisiana. And this front image, if you're from Louisiana, which I believe most of the people on this call are, is a very familiar, sobering picture that wakes you up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat. It is a projected sea level rise inundation for coastal Louisiana. And an important context, a piece of context for the presentation today. And so first things first, the founder of the feast, why we're even having this conversation, several federal bills that were passed under this administration that funnel federal dollars to state oil and gas regulatory programs, specifically their orphan well plugging programs. And in our case, that is the oil field site restoration program operated by Louisiana's Department of Energy and Natural Resources, henceforth now referred to as DENR throughout this presentation. Okay, so we have in total just under 200 million going to Louisiana for our wells. And so what Louisiana reported specifically to the Department of the Interior includes just under 5,000 wells at a cost of 401 million. If you remember the last slide, that means we're only going to be able to officially go after half of our well inventory. And Louisiana also disclosed that 12,000 Louisiana oil and gas workers lost their jobs between March 1st, 2020 and November 15th, 2021. Important context for the rest of this presentation. But one important thing to understand is that unlike other states, for instance, in Appalachia, Pennsylvania, where their huge orphaned well inventories are a consequence of, the past where before records keeping, a lot of Louisiana's orphan well inventory is a recent phenomenon and at a pretty steady clip. The blue line shows wells that are orphaned by industry, and the orange line are wells that are plugged by the oil field site restoration program. And as you can see, it is we're not making too much progress when you consider how many wells are being orphaned. And also, Louisiana has already been losing oil and gas workers before the COVID lockdowns. In 2015, you can see a huge dip in direct employment, particularly upstream production jobs. And it is most likely a consequence of the overturn of the crude oil export ban which flooded the global markets and caused a huge drop in commodity prices. And a quick way for firms to make up those losses was to shed workforce quickly, which is, as you can see, what they did. And that was only accelerated in 2020 and continues to go. We're starting to level out a little bit, but as we can see now, the industry is leaner and meaner, and there's a great deal of workers who have available skills that will languish unless we put them to use, but good thing we have a use for them. And then the other piece of context is that orphaned wells are not the only wells that are due for decommissioning in the near future. This beautiful map can show you, we have our bright pink orphaned wells, our unplugged wells, about just under 30,000 are the blue dots, and then the bright red are active wells. And we're going to break that down a little bit more. So a huge part of Louisiana's inventory of unplugged wells are inactive wells where they haven't produced. And we have over 25,000 non-producing unplugged wells in Louisiana that for our purposes are materially no different from an orphaned well. They're unplugged, they're not producing commercial products, they're posing a hazard to local communities, at best just a nuisance, at worst a real material hazard. Louisiana has just passed a future utility rule that imposes escalating fines for these inactive wells, so that is a move in a great direction. But as of November 2023, over 12,000 of Louisiana's inactive wells have not produced any oil or gas in over 10 years. So that's just a lot of unused real estate right now. And then of those producing wells that are actually producing commercial product, a vast majority of Louisiana's producing wells are stripper wells. They're marginal. Actually, half of Louisiana's producing inventory produces less than 1 barrel of oil equivalent per day. It's pretty stark when you look at that. And some recent scholarship, there was a, I'm going to say it wrong, Inervarus, I can never say it correctly. The presentation recently pointed out that the new methane rules that Dr. Cumpton just presented on will likely accelerate plugging and abandonment timelines for many of these stripper wells and increase the risk of orphaning, because the pay to delay current rubric will be only accelerated by the additional cost of meeting those new EPA methane rules. And as Dr. Cumpton teased for his presentation, not only do we have these variants in types of wells, we also have a variance in where these wells are located and the conditions in which workers and firms have to operate in. And so as you can see this beautiful boot, one thing to know is that it was built by the Mississippi River, and that bottom part of the boot is actually rapidly eroding and washing into the Gulf of Mexico, and not in small part because of oil and gas production. And for those who are unfamiliar with Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis, the state is actively pursuing a $50 billion state master plan to try and restore coastal habitats, particularly to protect inland communities from coastal storms and coastal inundation. And so an important piece of the orphaned well program, of the methane mitigation, of all of this, is that it must act in concert and support this $50 billion master plan. It's not simply a matter of putting some concrete in a well bore and moving on. It is making sure that you remediate the entire site. And in the case of Louisiana, that could mean acres of habitat that have been destroyed over decades because of produced water being allowed to spill and contribute to marsh degradation, pipeline canals that accelerated saltwater intrusion, or land subsidence because of subsurface fluid withdrawal. And so a little bit more into that. So the vast majority of Louisiana's wells are onshore, accessible by car, easy to get to. And so the workforce requirement side of that is going to be about as equal as it is in other states. But then those inland coastal wetland areas, we use Agerton's count, about 5,000 unplugged wells in Louisiana's inland waterways. And then while offshore wells are a minority of the wells, they require a considerable amount of workforce. And so we just have shy of 3,000 unplugged wells. And I'm going to introduce the group to the big mystery that this report uncovered. In correspondence with Diener, we found out that the 2,000 plus platforms that are in Louisiana state waters, so that is from Louisiana's coast 3 nautical miles out, then it's federal waters, the OCS, the Outer Continental Shelf. No one is currently monitoring or enforcing decommissioning timelines for the platforms in state waters. The last available count is 2,000 platforms, but we don't know the state of those platforms. I made inquiries into the oil spill coordinator's office, to BOEM, Bessie, Coast Guard, Corps of Engineers, every state office, to find out if there is any agency monitoring these platforms to see, like, when are they due for decommissioning for this report. And no one could give me a straight answer. So that is the mystery that is open. We have an unsolved mystery right now, but it has big implications for workforce in the future, but also for other activities that Louisiana is actively planning for, whether that is coastal restoration, you know, in terms of access to borrow sites, the sand to deposit at coastal restoration sites, or whether it's for state offshore wind, or carbon capture and storage, which is something that the state is already actively pursuing. But there's a whole lot of stuff in the way. And so just to give you an idea of what these different contexts look like, the top left corner is Timblier Island, and it was a restoration project by the CPRA that was foiled. There's about 900 wells behind this barrier island, but they had to stop the project because there was a nest of pipelines really preventing them from doing the work. The one on the right was captured by Scott Eustace at Healthy Gulf. I don't know what's going on, but it looks like it's had a bit too much to drink. It's just all cockeyed and crumbling into the Gulf. And so that is the average state of platforms in state waters. And then to the left is, bottom left quadrant is a typical Christmas tree in a Louisiana bay. And then bottom right is what remains. I believe that's Plaquemines Parish around Venice. And you can see those straight lines. Those are, you know, our pipeline access canals, or just general navigation canals for oil and gas, just to give you an idea of the restoration that will be required for these wells. And so here's our attempt at a taxonomy of all of the various wells in Louisiana. One thing to point out is that these are known wells. This does not include undocumented wells. Louisiana has done a fairly good job of keeping track of its wells for its entire history, but we don't know what we don't know. And it is not unusual for us to come across undocumented wells, even in Louisiana, and I'm sure there are plenty in coastal areas. Another thing to keep in mind that I didn't really go into are wells that were plugged prior to 1953, and indeed even wells that were plugged recently that have failed. We are now understanding that failure rates are higher than we had previously acknowledged. And so we estimate in the report a percentage of wells that probably have failed and will need re-abandoning in the near future. And so here's a messy, very data, if you want to do your screenshot now, but the report will be coming out. We wanted to capture with this report the variance, the unknowable, because there's so much variance in Louisiana wells. We can't know exactly how many workers and how many days and how much money it is going to plug every well. We don't have a straight back of the envelope number. And indeed, in our correspondence with Diener, they confirmed that a northern Louisiana well might take anywhere between 1 and 2 days, plus or minus 24 hours. But wells located in southern Louisiana offshore deep complex could take 2 to 4 days or a month. And so we felt that using a variety of methods and a variety of data sources and creating ranges was appropriate for this report to help planners, to help trade unions, to help businesses understand the demand in the near future. Of course, economies of scale can lower these numbers, bundling projects, but given the complexity and the oil field site restoration program's own history of some of these wells and how long, like a monster well comes out of nowhere, that this range was appropriate. And so, like I said before, we looked at a variety of data sources from the OSR program itself. They have very good data, to Betsie's cost data and direct bid data that we were able to procure from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They were very helpful. There are several national wildlife refuges in Louisiana with active oil and gas production and orphaned wells on their properties. And right now, there are several projects proceeding forward. And we were able to access Atchafalaya National Wildlife Refuge well site bids, which included information for 7 well sites. It worked out to $1.1 million for those well sites, $170,000 per well, total man hours, just under 7,500, Workers per well, which includes plugging and abandonment and remediation, was 26 workers. Hours per well, just over 1,000. And using that data, we were able to create a multiplier for these types of wells in these wetland areas for 0.56. To give you a greater insight into the workers, the bid data had very good information on the types of workers. So the plugging and abandonment crews, they had the wireline crew, the cement crew, and the rig crew. And the remediation was very interesting to me, as well, I'm sure to everyone in the audience, because it gives you a peel back of the curtain of the actual type of skills and training that will be necessary to do this work. So there's operators, heavy machinery drivers, roustabouts, cleaning techs, supervisors, and pusher. In total, like I said, 26 direct workers. One thing to keep in mind is that this particular job site was accessible by vehicle. You did not need a boat or a helicopter to get to it, and it was in a fairly well-preserved site area. It was, a national wildlife refuge. There isn't an expansive amount of damage. It's pretty well-maintained relative to some of the other southern Louisiana sites. And so, as Dr. Cumpton mentioned, we used two methods. One was just looking at the direct jobs, like looking at payroll data or getting an idea of okay, how many people are physically at the site? And here's our ranges. So between, I know this is a big range, y'all, but think of that Diener correspondence between 2 days and a month. And so this gives you an idea of how big that range is. And the 2.4 multiplier for inland wells actually comes from the Agerton, where we kind of reverse engineered it. And the 7.4 is courtesy of Justin Soleil, our True Transition Fellow and former snubbing engineer, who himself has shallow Louisiana plugging experience. And this multiplier is based on two things. One, a study that BOEM conducted about 15 years ago, and another was Justin's own estimate based on projects that he did, where you assume 5 days of work with a crew of about 50 people working 24 hours, 12-hour shifts. And so that works out to 7.4. And that is just for plugging the well. That is not removing the platform. And so another way to look at that and get the visual. And then the spending method, you will see the report for all the precise sources of this data, but we use for the inland wells, we use the Department of Interior's estimates, the multiplier in the last one, the 0.23, and the 2 job years per million are courtesy of the Department of the Interior, and we felt aligned pretty well with Louisiana's notice of intent. They were fairly close, about that 80,000 mark. And then the inland wells are the Agerton numbers again. We get an idea of what that looks like with this visual. And so using those same multiplier ranges, looking at the money that is actually being spent and allocated now. So we have the bottom left, those are the different methods, the different multipliers, and it's between 394 jobs to 1,200 jobs as our estimate for this current round of spending. And again, that is for just about, I think, 2,500 wells across Louisiana. And so that's for this current round of funding. And one thing to keep in mind, and something that I try to emphasize in the report, is all of this is based on information that we are given. And anyone who is familiar with oil and gas production understands that orphan well plugging and remediation is the lowest value phase of an oil or gas well's life. You do not make profit from plugging a well. And so you try to keep those costs and staff as low as you can. But the public has a different incentive and motive. It is to make sure the job is done to the highest extent, is done well. And in Louisiana's case, is done to the best degree possible to ensure Louisiana's future survival because of our coastal land loss crisis. But also, we want to make sure that we are contributing to our employment roles, as was the intent of the congressional language. So something to keep in mind, that these prior figures don't necessarily mandate future projects. And so a little bit of the report, or a big part of the report, is talking about how can we structure this program for success in the long term, because we know that this current round of funding is a round of funding, but there is good evidence to support that this program might be re-upped. But that hinges on whether it meets the mission of the statutory language. And one of those missions is creating good middle-class jobs. And, I like to point out these quotes because you see this a lot in oil and gas business coverage. It's like, we just can't find workers. Where are they? Where'd they go? It's so hard. And you actually can see this in the literature going back, time immortal, as long as the oil and gas industry has existed. I found a BOEM report, or MMS, excuse me, from the 90s that interviewed Louisiana firms about their ability to find good workforce. And they're like, well, we just can't find people. But keep in mind, this was a year after they fired 70% of their workers. And they were surprised that people didn't want to return to the industry when that chance of being fired was so great. Oops, excuse me, I went the wrong direction. And so we, True Transition, actually we carried out a survey about 2 years ago of oil and gas workers across all streams across the United States. We had 1,600 responses. And one thing that, of course, workers shared is that half had been fired because of the 2020 lockdowns, but they had been previously fired at least once or on multiple occasions. 17% had been fired more than once, 35% fired at least once before. So the boom and bust is felt perhaps more by the workers than the C-suite. And that makes it less attractive for this highly skilled workforce to return and support these programs. And we asked, because they were experiencing, when we sent out the survey was kind of at the height of this downturn, what could the government do, or what training would they be interested in? And without a shadow of a doubt, the most interest came with the idea of direct federal government employment to plug oil and gas wells, or training for well plugging and pipeline removal. So there's certainly eager interest in this field. And I'm gonna leave you to just read the report and read our recommendations. But there's a lot of things that the state of Louisiana can do, that the trade unions in Louisiana can do, that the community colleges can do to capture this workforce. We have spent, a century cultivating this expertise, and it would be a shame to lose these workers and their skills to other states that are already developing apprenticeship programs and strong project labor agreements, and developing programs that are built to last. If we were to lose those workers to other states and not get, have Louisiana workers do this well plugging remediation work for our benefit. And so, this is the thing we pointed out a lot while writing this report, is that it took decades to install this iron and thousands of workers, and it will require no less to remove it. So I'll turn it over to Megan to facilitate. And let's see, oh no, hey, Boomer.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was fantastic information, and I am extremely grateful to both Dr. Greg Cumpton and Megan Biven for not only all of this excellent work on the report, but the excellent presentations you guys have given us this morning, this evening, depending on where you are. We have some fantastic questions. People are very interested in this topic, which makes me very happy. One question that we received before the webinar, actually, in advance, was what kind of work/training programs exist in Louisiana for folks interested in leaving oil and gas?
Okay, this is a question for me, and I want to know whether, Megan, are people able to actually send us chats, or is that something I need to do?
So you can ask. A couple of people have live been asking us questions in the Q&A. We have 3 questions there, and we have a couple of questions.
Okay, just want to make sure that people have that possibility. Okay. So since we received this question beforehand, I was familiar with some, but I know that in the report we talk about how Diener is working with the Louisiana Chamber of Commerce and one of the main contractors for the oil field site restoration, Lemoyne Disaster Recovery, to develop worker and company outreach in order to advance its disadvantaged business enterprise efforts. So that is really about increasing the density of minority-owned businesses in this work. And so I did inquire with the Chamber of Commerce what the status of this was. I did not receive any information. So if there's someone from Diener on this chat, give us an update. But in terms of offshore wind is proving to be a a really bright spot in Louisiana of opportunity. Nunez Community College in Chalmette, Louisiana, just announced free tuition for 20 students to enter their 2-year program that trains students as entry-level turbine technicians for the growing wind energy sector. And then UNO has, the University of New Orleans has its wind energy hub, and students received 5,000 scholarships and a paid internship with German wind energy developer RWE, who secured the state the leases in state waters. And so there's a lot of things moving and happening, and I know there's additional federal funds. It's just really a matter of connecting people to those opportunities. And these so far seem to be focused on people who are like fresh out of school, and there isn't really anything yet targeting existing workforce who's moving from the oil and gas industry, but I know there is a great deal of effort and discussion about creating those opportunities. And so it's an ongoing project.
Great, thank you. Greg, I actually would like to ask a question that you did answer very nicely in the chat. I want to ask it out loud so that everybody can hear. The question was, Dr. Cumpton mentioned the need for upskilling in oil industry workers for this effort. Is there an estimated time frame needed for this training before the work can begin?
Yeah, that's such an excellent question. I think that as I responded there, in that it depends on both level of skills of workers and also state and national certification requirements. But typically, it would be between, I think I said like 3 weeks or 3 months, or 6 weeks and 3 months. Let's see. I answered this and I was very clear at the moment. Yeah, task between 6 weeks and a maximum of 3 months, which is also very important because note that you have to pay people to train. You know, there are additional job requirements that will be required for that, and you also have to have the facilities and the ability to do so. So, it's definitely an opportunity for folks.
Great, thank you. Another question that we had before the webinar was, I have read that Chevron claims they are cleaning their valve emissions. How is this verified?
Boy, that's such a great question. I would love to be able to say exactly who is verifying this. Note that at least for the EPA rules, the industry and the companies themselves are required to engage in this monitoring, and they're required to report it. However, the rules themselves aren't very clear as to like the actual requirements in that reporting. So typically, for many EPA rules, there is a once a year sort of download of data. This is the stuff that we've done. Where that data goes specifically within EPA, and then who is actually monitoring that data to ensure that it is statistically consistent, right? That we see similar evidence of real data versus unreal data isn't necessarily very clear in the rules. So, but they should be reporting this on a regular basis at a minimum of once a year through to the EPA.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is, what is the plan to ensure these workers will have the right and responsibility to voice concerns when a job is unsafe?
It's a great question, and one that is an ongoing issue in Louisiana. And obviously, if it's through the state program, the greatest lever they have is through DENR itself to alert DENR if something is wrong. That is the state oil and gas regulator. OSHA and Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division are both active in Louisiana and have great contacts. But also, you know, one thing that we argue and put forward in the report is a return to trade union membership in the oil and gas industry, because that makes sure that there is someone else on that rig floor beyond the worker and their employer, that there is a third party looking out for the workers themselves. And we think that there is a strong business case for that as well in Louisiana, and making sure that these projects succeed. That is an ongoing project. I see that someone has raised their hand. I think I'm gonna give them the floor. Is that okay? I'm technically the host of this, so I'm going to allow them to talk.
Great.
All right. So Jennifer, it's all you. I think you can talk. Talking permitted. But you're on mute. Okay. Well, then we'll go to another question until Jennifer can join us.
Okay. So one more question, a couple more questions. The entities owning these abandoned and inactive wells will be responsible for the cost, correct? Who holds these entities accountable for this?
Ooh. Yeah, it's a great question. We are strong supporters of the polluter pay principle. And there's an unfortunate reality in Louisiana and throughout the United States. So orphaned wells. Okay, let's see if I can say this correctly. Andy, I know you're on this call. So this is paid by the public purse. The bill itself, the federal bill, does have language that requires that states go back and try and recoup cost from responsible parties if there is a responsible party to go after. I know, Andy, that those have very specific meanings and I might be using them incorrectly. Louisiana has a not so great rule that kind of ties the hands of Diener in going up the chain unless, so if a public scent is expended, which is this is the case, it actually prevents the state from collecting from parties unless that money, $250,000 has been expended, and then it goes in sequential order. It's not a great situation, you know, it's not in this report, but we have previously recommended over and over again, several recommendations, including establishing like a collections unit within state agencies with the Department of the Interior itself, or establishing a federal severance tax that taxes production to fund this. There is a oil field site restoration fund. There's a small fee that is in Louisiana that goes and funds the oil field site restoration program on an annual basis. But once a certain cap has been reached, they stop collecting, which is a bit absurd. There's a lot of more knives that we could be using, or sticks, excuse me. But we have been so far using a lot of carrots. So the unfortunate answer is that we're not collecting as much from the industry as we could. And we are subsidizing this to a large extent. But there are things that we could be doing.
Okay. The next question is, are these one-time projects or ongoing programs?
So for the methane rules, this is going to be an ongoing requirement of oil and gas operators. So it is not a program, it is just a rule that they will now have to abide by. And for the federal well plugging program, it does have an end date. It does have a set amount of money that I can't remember the exact end date. But yeah, there is an end date. The oil field site restoration program itself in Louisiana is just an ongoing function of the Louisiana Diener. And then just well plugging in general, like as we try to show, is going to be just a needed thing. Like there are decommissioning timelines. There are actually rules on the book that require that operators plug these wells. But how we design that program, how we enforce that, that is still yet to be determined. And to Kai's question, we will have a recording online.
Yes, that's okay, great. So you answered that question. There will be a recording online. Also, the question, what labor standards, if any, are there to ensure that unions play a pivotal role addressing methane emissions?
So that is a lot of what the report goes into at the end. So there are a lot of things that state agencies can do to ensure that there is a high union density. They can have contract language that requires a certain percentage of workers, or excuse me, the firms have a apprenticeship requirement so that workforce has gone, like that just pretty much is like a backdoor way for union firms to get in and have that. There is some language in the Department of Interior's guidance to state programs that asks them to describe their labor practices and what they have done to increase union participation. And some states are already really responding well to that. So one example that we really like is in California, where the Workforce Commission at the state itself has issued I forget how much, not a loan, a grant to a private firm. So California Well Legacy Services, LIUNA, and the operating engineers to create an apprenticeship program for well plugging. And so it's private-public partnership with the states, with the private firm, and with unions. And so right now they're developing this apprenticeship program, and they will be the ones that will be plugging those wells in, because, you know, California has a rich history of oil and gas production and orphaned wells being right next to people in cities like Los Angeles. And so we think that's a great model, is that, you know, if we want this program to be durable, if we want these jobs to be middle class, then there is an opportunity for firms in Louisiana to see that we have trained workers, and we have, like, you know, one big problem that I pointed out is that firms are having trouble locating workers. Well, that we cite in our report that union halls are a great way to recruit and retain workers. Because there's a big thing I didn't touch in the presentation was that production is really high in the United States right now. We are producing more oil and gas than we ever have. And so that means that this orphan well plugging program is actively competing with production. And so workers will see, okay, I can make a few more dollars going and working in the Permian than I can here. So I'm just going to go do my 2-week hitch over there instead of doing this project. And so if Louisiana wants to retain these workers, well, they have to think long term. They have to invest in the very people doing this work and think of this not just as a one-off project. I'm like, buying for a particular service, but investing in a durable program. I hope I answered that.
That's great. That's great. Thank you for that answer. And the last question, and if anyone else has any more questions, please pop them in the Q&A. But the last question that I see is, where is the report? And that is an excellent question to to lead us into telling you that once the report is ready for distribution, we will be emailing it to you, those of you who signed up for the webinar, and it will also be on the truetransition.org website. TrueTransition.org is again where to stay connected with True Transition, and also at gregory.cumpton@gmail.com is Dr. Gregory's email address to remain connected with him. And otherwise, I want to thank again our panelists for your excellent work, your excellent presentations, and thank you so much to the attendees for your interest in this and for joining us this evening. Or this
morning.
If
Sorry,
you're in Louisiana, excuse me.
Evening here. Evening somewhere. It's evening here. Thank y'all so much. Please stay in touch. I'm Megan at truetransition.org as well. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been such a terrific project to work on, and I really look forward to seeing its impact in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.